Welcome to Leave No Doubt, kindly sponsored by our friends at Connection Technologies. I've been joined by a friend of mine and sports psychologist, James Maiden. James, thank you for being here. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Very well. Thank you for having me.
I thought it would be a good idea, James, if, because sports psychology isn't something that we've spoken about on this podcast before. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if, it might be a good idea if you sort of give us a little bit of an introduction into who you are, what it is you do, and a little bit of a brief background as to how you've got into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, of course. And I've had a little troll through some of the podcasts that you've done, and there's some nice stuff in there, and players talking around pressures and anxieties and things like that. But I guess my role specifically, and we're at the University of Winchester today filming this, which is where I work, and I'm not gonna bore you too much with the kind of ins and outs of what I do. But I guess my role at Winchester specifically is around supporting teaching, supporting learning, lecturing on the degrees, consultancy, applied work, that type of thing, which is, I guess, maybe what we're a little bit more interested in today. So my kind of background, so to speak, I'm currently in training, so I'm at the very last stage. So I'm waiting for final exam to become qualified as a fully qualified sports psych. So it's about all in all, it's been a 8-year process, which has been long. It's been a labour of love, so to speak. But I guess my applied work really started, and where we first met was obviously down at Eastleigh Football Club. So that was kind of my first piece of applied work post masters, which I did at Loughborough. I did some work with the kind of university badminton squad at Loughborough, which was really exciting. So in terms of the quality there, a lot of them were top 5 in the country, had represented various countries at Commonwealth Games and things like that. So that was, again, a really great experience for me to, I guess, try and put into practice some of the things that I'd been learning about. But obviously, since we first met at Eastleigh, I've kind of gone on a slightly, I guess, different journey in some ways. I've done a lot of work in football, predominantly women's football. So I've worked at Southampton Football Club. I worked there for a number of years, and that was really positive. I really enjoyed it. Working in a team environment, obviously similar to Eastleigh, but different in many ways. Obviously, working with female athletes was a new experience for myself, and I really enjoyed it. There's obviously different challenges that come with working with females. I've done some work with a Hampshire cricketer, kind of one-on-one, worked with a para-football academy at Southampton. So a lot of you will know Scott Sinclair. I worked with his brother Martin Sinclair, who's represented kind of England and GB at various kind of World Cups and kind of Commonwealth Games, Olympics for the kind of para football teams for cerebral palsy, which was really exciting, really new experience for me, which was good. I'd done some work as a coach with athletes with disabilities before, so it's a nice experience to kind of channel some of the sports psych. But I guess I know I've rambled on a wee bit, but I guess my current experience is I'm working with county golf unions. So obviously, you and I have spoken a little bit about golf before, but that's one of my big passions at the minute, working in golf. So I'm currently working with of an under-18s junior county golf academy, which is really exciting. So again, that's a different perspective, looking at a review. And I'm also working with an academy footballer at Southampton on scanning and decision making, which is probably something the audience of this podcast know a little bit more about. So
amazing, mate. That sounds super exciting. I know, look, I mentioned it before. We've never had a sports psychologist on the podcast, and the way that I think I've planned on sort of separating this conversation is that for maybe half an hour we discuss some of the the generic things specific to football that people might go through and ways they might be able to deal with that, and then the second 30 minutes I thought I'd sort of use myself as a case study really as to how players can understand how conversations like these with sports psychologists go, what they might look like, and sort of the content of what's included. So just to get us started, mate, I thought I'd get your opinion on, I know you've obviously been only sort of at least learning for the last 8 years, and we did meet each other a while ago at Eastleigh whilst I was playing there, but where do you think the game is going in terms of sports psychology, and how important of an aspect do you think that the mental side of the game is at the moment?
Yeah, no, it's definitely growing, the mental side of it. And I think it takes multiple different facets in terms of you might meet sports psychologists in a similar situation to this potentially, where we're kind of sat down in a room having a meeting. I guess my outlook on things is I want to do a lot of stuff on the pitch, which I'll talk to in a second. But in terms of where the game's going, so particularly at academy level, if we take that to start with, those academies that fall under the kind of category system, so whether it's category 1, category 2 and so on, they have to follow certain parameters. So the EPPP, I don't know if you've heard of that, but as part of those parameters, they have to have sports psychology involved. So in terms of that, in terms of what academy players are getting now to maybe what they're getting 10, 20, 30 years ago, there's a lot more sports psychology out there, and I think the fact that they're growing up with it reduces the stigma a little bit. And I know there's often a stigma around sports psychologists. They're here to read my mind, or they're here to they're only here because something's wrong. And I think one of the things, or one of the places where we want to get to, is that's not the case. We're not here to read your mind. We're not here to, I guess, fix something. There is, I guess, an element of helping when things maybe aren't going correctly, but that's not it. That's not what we're solely about. For me, a sports psychologist has to be embedded in the system, not just there when things go wrong. They're out on the training field day in, day out, helping with sessions and seeing the players on, where they feel, in a place where they feel most comfortable, which is more often than not the football pitch. So in terms of how sports psychology is growing, I think it's growing massively, especially within football.
Yeah, my interpretation of it, mate, if you give me my perception on sports therapy, is obviously I've played football for a number of years now, and I've never really experienced it too much. But it's my understanding of what it looks like is sort of like a therapy sort of thing, right? And I'm sure many other players listening to this, or many people, supporters listening in on getting an insight into what players maybe have access to. That's sort of my perception of what it looks like. I've never really seen sports psychology as something that might happen during a session, or associate it with performance, like as in training actually on the field. I've always associated it with being in a classroom, like sort of how we are now. How is that sort of, obviously the academy guys are using therapy now, they're using sports psychology a lot. Yeah. But when I say sports psychologist, what actually does that mean? And sort of what is your role within the game and within football specifically? How are you managing to help people, do you think?
Yeah, it's, again, you get 5 sports psychologists sat in this room and they'll probably give you a different answer. I guess in terms of my viewpoint, and maybe how my journey has changed a little bit, and which maybe hopefully answers your question. When I came into Eastley, it was very much, I'm going to change the world through interventions. I'm going to give these guys, footballers, all of these amazing skills, mental skills, and which I'm sure we'll touch on shortly, on how we want to help them improve their game.
I'm so excited to welcome to the pod our new sponsors, Connection Technologies, a market leader in business-to-business tools ranging from business mobile, hosted telephony and fixed line services. Head over to their website at www.connection-technologies.co.uk, fill in their web inquiry form and find out how Connection Technologies can help your business.
Okay, and but now it's maybe more of a different perspective. It might be more of a kind of, well, you've got football, but then you've got your home life. So how can we? Again, for me, that's a relationship that goes hand in hand. So trying to kind of look at both of those things, take the footballer as a whole person rather than just, I've got Joe here as a footballer, but I've got Joe as the friend, we've got Joe as a family man, that type of thing. So there's more to it than just sport. Again, sports psychology takes different facets. As you say, it might be in a classroom, we might be doing psychoeducation work, we might be sitting down and going through goal setting, for example, or it might be on the pitch. So examples that I've done, pressure training is a good example. So how can we change a training session to induce pressure that you'd maybe feel or something similar to on a match day? How can we create scenarios in games that you might, or in training that you might feel on match day? So there's different ways of doing it. You'll get sports psychologists and clinical sports psychologists that maybe associate more with wellbeing. So again, I know we're going to talk a little bit around anxiety and things like that later on. So you might have, apologies, you can hear the dog barking in the background, which is obviously not ideal for the podcast, but so you might get sports psychologists deal with wellbeing, okay, and kind of mental health aspects and things like that. So I know it's a bit of a loose answer to your question, but there's loads of different facets to this. And when we think of, similar to football, there's loads of different coaches that you'll get, as you know.
Well, let's try and James, we'll try and break it down then a little bit. Let's start with because we've done some work together before, and obviously I've got access to some documents that you've sent me that I wasn't able to use to share in the end. Obviously, used them for myself, but one of the things we'll start with is the word mindset. Right? Is the word mindset gets spoken about a lot in football. Having a strong mindset. What's his mindset like? Or I should say, what's their mindset like for any female footballers that are listening to this? Building your mindset. Could you explain to us what a mindset is, and what that word means and what it looks like?
Yeah, and again, it's different for everybody, but essentially what a mindset is it's almost a set of beliefs or attitudes that you or I have as an athlete that I guess affect or kind of influence how we maybe feel, how we behave, how we think. So again, it's almost those innate things that make you up or make you up as a person in some ways. And there's different ways of describing the mindset. And I know you've got some of the stuff that I sent to you before. So things such as a growth mindset. So you have this idea that you're not kind of stuck in a box, so to speak. You can grow and you can change the abilities that you have. Whereas some people might have more of a fixed mindset, and they see themselves as stuck in being in a certain box. They feel that their ability is going to stay constant, is going to stay the same. You have other things such as a challenge versus threat mindset. So this idea of do you see pressurized situations as a chance to grow? Do you have the coping mechanisms to cope with the demands of that situation? And that would be seen as a challenge state if you do have those coping mechanisms. Whereas maybe if you have a threat state or a threat mindset, you'd maybe argue that individual doesn't have the coping mechanisms to cope with the demands. So there's different ways of defining mindset, and I know I've briefly gone over a couple there, but essentially it's your beliefs, your attitudes that you have that influence the way that you kind of think, you feel, and that you behave on, whether it is on a match day or kind of Monday to Friday when you're at home and at training.
So is there anything that people listening to this can do, mate, to sort of work out where they're at and what might be going through their mind? Because I know that we're having a conversation, right, that hopefully is going to benefit people and arguably even myself. But not everybody's got access to sports psychologists, right? Not everybody can, we'll get into it later about what sort of expense a sports psychologist might cost and things like that. But people don't have, they don't have the access to it. But if they want to understand a little bit more about their mindset, about what's going on in their mind, obviously that relates to their football performance, how can they work out, or where can they go to figure all this out? Yeah,
and there's loads of stuff out there in terms of YouTube videos and podcasts like this, and that kind of allude to that. And something that they can go and watch, or people watching this can go and freely access. But in terms of, I guess, a quick thing that we've spoken about a little bit in kind of prior to this was around emotional intelligence, and that's a lot around, or if you wanted to be particular around this and define it, that's about understanding kind of my own feelings and emotions as well as yours, and then acting upon that. So something that I like is something that I like, and I think it really helps a player, a coach, or whoever it may be to really understand, I guess, what they're thinking, and what they're feeling, which then ultimately influences behaviour. And one kind of easy way to, I guess, reflect upon that or start to put that down is just make a note of how you've maybe felt during the day. So how have you felt during training? How have you felt prior to a match? So again, it could be things, I feel confident, or I feel anxious prior to a game. Okay, great. Well, how did the game go? How did you react to that emotion? Okay, did it have a negative impact? Did it have a positive impact? And then you can start to almost collect a record of how you're feeling, how you've reacted to it. And then if you're noticing that there's maybe more of a kind of negative trend, so to speak, if you're constantly maybe feeling anxious prior to a game, and it's not, because anxiety can have both a positive and negative impact, right? And again, we'll touch on that. But if it's constantly having maybe a negative impact on performance, then we can start to say, well, maybe there's more of a kind of maybe fixed or threat mindset going on there potentially, and you can start to put things in place to rectify that. So there's the simple strategies that again we'll touch upon later in terms of mental skills that you can use to help cope with things such as performance anxiety. But yeah, one quick thing to do is just make a note of how you're feeling and reflect on that.
See, you've mentioned it at the start of this already, mate, this conversation about how sports psychology and conversations like we're having, or players reaching out to sports psychologists is often seen as a negative move, right? It's because something is going badly. Would you say that off the back of what you've just said, it's quite important for people to understand what emotions they're going through, even if they're positive?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the things that we speak about, particularly, at university here when we speak to our students, and again, it goes hand in hand when working with athletes, celebrate the successes, celebrate the positives. We don't want to focus solely on the negatives. You got a bad grade in your last assignment. Okay, well, that's 1 out of 10. The other 9 you've done really well in. Okay, and if we only focus on the negative, we're always going to have that kind of that negative mindset. We're always going to feel, I was anxious yesterday. Okay, great, but that's only one day. The other 6 days of the week you've had really positive. You've been really positive. It's just one day. So again, I think it's really important to notice what's going wrong. If we reflect on performances or emotions, notice what we're feeling, and if that is negative or if that is potentially having an impact poorly on performance or whatever it may be, then it's understanding that might just be that day, and then looking at the positives in terms of reflecting, well, this has gone really well, this is my super strength, and understanding that if we can make our strengths into super strengths and strengths better, that's really good. We really want to do that. But again, if we only focus on the negatives, then our strengths that we had may fall behind. So I think it's just again a bit of a loose answer to your question, but I think focusing or looking at the positives is important to celebrate those small wins, those small successes along the way.
See, at my age, mate, people will know who listen to this podcast that I'm getting to the latter stages of my career. I'm 32 years old. I know that obviously football is moving in a way now that sort of like mid to late 30-year-olds are still doing very well. That the very top of the elite game, we're seeing guys like obviously Messi, the Ronaldos, the Modric's, that are still like high 30s, and the Benzemas that are still incredible players, arguably the best players in the world, right? So at my age, I've never really spent much time on this. I've been through these emotions. We're speaking now, and I've mentioned it on here before. I've suffered performance anxiety, a lot in my career, and we'll get into that later. But is there an age that you think, is it too late for me to start something like this, or do you think it's just appropriate for young guys who are now stepping into the game to sort of get to grips that this is a thing, or is this for everybody who's playing or will become players, that they should, that they can address sports psychology and they can get on board? Yeah,
no, it's all about those 1%, right? And that doesn't change whether you're kind of an 18-year-old coming into the first team or trying to get into the first team at a Premier League club, or as you say, you're maybe somebody that's coming to the latter stages of their career. It doesn't change. You always want to find those extra 1% and performance benefits, and I think the psychology may take a different form. There might be slightly different variations of it depending on what I guess developmental age is probably the wrong time of phrase, but what stage of your career you're at. So again, transitions is a huge thing. So again, a psychologist might look at transitions, and that might be whether you're kind of an 18-year-old trying to get in the first team, or whether you're kind of 38, 39-year-old coming out of football. So sports psychology is relevant, in my opinion, for all ages. And I don't think I know we're on here kind of talking to footballers and things like that, but it's not solely relevant for athletes. I've worked with, I know people that have worked in business, or have worked in the NHS, or have worked in the military. So it's not solely based for those elite level athletes, so to speak. It's relevant for everyone. It's just trying to change it, or change the way that it's delivered to suit the needs of that person at the time.
Okay, mate. Let's get back onto football then specifically, and hopefully how we can help people. Developing mental skills is something that I've got written down here, because it's something that we discussed previously, and discussed developing mental skills that obviously specifically relate to football performance. Could you give us a brief introduction as to what mental skills are and what sort of topics are included, in that?
Yeah, and there's a lot of mental skills out there, and some of the more prominent ones you've probably heard of, or I know we've spoken about, and the guys listening to this have probably heard of. But essentially, it's a mental skill, mental resources, giving us the tools to cope with any given situation, whether that's football related or not. So we want to have the skills, the tools, the resources to be able to cope with the demands of the situation. So if our resources outweigh those demands, then hypothetically we're going to be able to cope with that situation and have a successful performance, let's say in football. If we don't have the skills or the tools or the resources to cope with those demands, then it's, again, hypothetically, we're going to have maybe a negative experience. And that doesn't just go for mental skills. It might be analysis or pre-match warm-up, that type of thing. But in terms of mental skills, the different types that you've probably all heard of are around imagery, goal setting, relaxation and breathing techniques, pre-performance routines are some of the common ones. Self-talk is another one. So there's plenty out there, and I'm not going to say everything works for everybody. It's a case of practicing them and kind of almost trial running them in, I guess, training games and training to see if they work for you. I wouldn't recommend kind of having a relaxation technique or a new routine, let's say, and putting that straight into practice right before a big game. Something that maybe there's a little bit more riding on it. So there's plenty out there, but essentially it's giving yourself the tools to be able to cope with the demands of a situation.
I think, James, some of the things that stand out to me then after you've said that is the imagery stuff, the pre-game routine, which some people may challenge is superstition. But, how do you feel about the word superstition? Is that?
I get it, and it's a bit of a slippery slope potentially in terms of what happens if you can't do this. And I think the key, especially with a routine, is flexibility. And I get the word superstition, but maybe as I guess somebody in my role, it's not something I'd use, but I understand it. So yeah, for me specifically, I'd try and move a client away from the word superstition and generating maybe more flexibility around that.
Okay, I mean, let's take that. We'll call it a pre-performance routine then. Okay. The imagery and the self-talk are the three things that really stand out to me there that I think people will be able to use quite easily. Could you break the three of them down and as to what they look like and how people can use that?
Yeah.
What sort of benefit it might have?
Yeah, definitely. So again, if we start with imagery, so first off, imagery can be put into a pre-performance routine as can self-talk. Pre-performance routine is quite a large thing potentially. But if we take imagery first off, and again, I'm gonna use a quote from a golfer. So Jack Nicklaus, if I'm sure you know who he is, but he says that he never hit a shot, not even in practice, without having a very sharp, in focus picture of it in his head. It was like a colour movie. So again, essentially, imagery is creating a picture, or in this case, a movie of something in your mind. So let's say it might be a free kick or a penalty in football. You maybe have, a cup final at the weekend. You visualize yourself taking a winning penalty or putting a free kick in the top corner. So again, it's visualizing something positive more often than not, of what you want to do or what you have done. So again, it could be visualizing a previous performance that you had. So let's say you scored a free kick, and I think you scored one not that long ago for Aldershot from outside the box, which, if I remember rightly,
it was a while ago. Yeah, it's for Bromley at Aldershot. Yeah, but okay. A while ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So
still living off it.
But if we take that example, so you might visualize that positive example. Okay, well, what did I do? What were the steps that I took? And with imagery, I would encourage you to look at it from your own eyes. So what were you seeing in that moment? Or you could visualize it from potentially a bird's eye view. So again, if we're looking at, let's say, a drone position, kind of what did it look like from above? So that's just one example.
What about, mate, if, we're going to touch on this imagery stuff. What about because I've tried that before and not been able to stop myself from seeing negative things, from seeing like, I'm trying my best to visualize, right, I've got a big game tomorrow and I'm going to do this, 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 and this. I'm going to cross a ball in that's going to end in a goal. But then at the same time, I don't know what it is, but maybe I'm thinking, oh, I hope I don't give the ball away for a goal. Or I hope my winger's not going to beat me every time he gets it, right? So how, is there a way to stop those thoughts coming into somebody's mind? Or is that, was that just me being negative and finding it difficult?
No, it happens, right? You are going to think about those negatives, and it's trying. I think for me, if I found one of my athletes continually thinking about those negatives, I'd ask them. There's only so much you can do. You can't change fully their thoughts and what they're thinking, but you'd want to encourage them to stop the imagery for a bit. So again, if you find yourself continually trying to do positive imagery, but it always goes back to potentially the negative, well, I suggest taking essentially a break from that, because if you can't get out of that kind of cycle of keep going through those negative steps, it's just trying to put almost a forceful stop to it, so to speak. But again, I would encourage somebody to, if we do have negatives, visualize them as well. So again, if you visualize your winger getting by you, okay, that's fine. But next time, well, what am I going to, almost reflect on it? What am I going to do to make sure he doesn't get by me next time? So he's taking the ball on my left side, and I know I'm right-footed. So I'm instead of allowing him to do that this time, I'm going to change my body position. I'm going to visualize me physically changing my body position. So I think it's with the football we've been working with on scanning, we've used imagery, and we've asked him to use negative performance as a way of reflection, a way of saying, well, I know this has gone wrong, accepting that it's gone wrong, and going, well, I'm going to put these steps in place to, I guess rectify it. So I wouldn't be completely put off if those thoughts are happening, but it's just trying to, again, channel them and change them and reframe them in a maybe more positive light.
Okay, so before we get onto the pre-performance routine stuff, let's talk about the self-talk. Is that similar to imagery, or what does self-talk look like?
Yeah, so again, it's similar to imagery. Instead of, I guess, a visual image or kind of a video that you're essentially playing in your mind, it's something that you're saying to yourself. So again, it could be something as simple as I'm gonna have a good game today. I'm feeling good. I'm feeling positive. I know what my role is, and we've used that as part of, again, a pre-performance routine, and using those helpful thoughts as part of the self-talk process of, well, I know at this stage in the change room prior to match day or prior to going out for the game, I know these are the type of things I'm going to say to myself to put myself in a positive frame of mind. So it's essentially is the same as imagery, but instead of, again, visualizing something, you're saying something to yourself. And
again, devil's advocate is this self-talk, right? If I'm telling myself on a Saturday, on a match day, you're going to be really good today. You feel good. You're going to be physically at your best. But I know that I don't feel physically at my best. Am I essentially lying? He's sort of suggesting that we essentially lie to ourselves, or say it's like the last performance I've had wasn't very good, but in the next game I'm thinking I'm going to play really well today. But in the back of my mind I'm thinking, I wasn't last game, so I'm not sure if I actually will be or not. Like, how are we sort of, that might be something that I'm going through. Like, what sort of conversation would you have with me? Obviously, other people might be thinking that, because I think this self-talk, like, I could tell myself every day I'm the best player in the world, right? But I know that I'm not. Like, and I know that I might not perform to the best version of myself every game. And I feel like, in my mind, that I'd be aware that I'm potentially lying to myself to try and trick my mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, it doesn't. I wouldn't suggest lying to yourself, but I think an awareness or self-awareness of those feelings is really important, right? If you are thinking those things, potentially it's that self-awareness of, well, this is what I'm thinking. This is maybe what happened last time, but again, it's using that as a tool to say, well, this is what happens. This is what happened last time. Okay, if we use that example, and again, it's just trying to reframe those emotions in a positive light. So again, it's trying to almost, I guess, forget is probably the wrong term of phrase, but try and put those emotions and those feelings to one side and saying, well, I've accepted this. I know this has happened, but I've reframed it into something more positive. So I wouldn't suggest, I wouldn't say lying to yourself. Again, it would be more around reframing what you're thinking. And again, using those negatives in terms of, again, we spoke around anxiety. Anxiety can be used as a positive. It's just how you view it, your perception of it. So again, it's around your perception of those emotions and accepting those emotions. I think we've spoken around, I guess, failure a wee bit before. So sometimes failure is deemed as the worst thing in the world, but actually, if we can accept it and reframe it and use it as a way to grow, and in the same vein, using these negative emotions as well, I've accepted those. I know these are here, but I'm going to reframe them into something more positive. And again, that's something you could go through with somebody like myself in terms of a sports psychologist, or you could go through it with a coach if you don't have access to it, and a coach that is amenable to sports psychology. So yeah, I don't know if that's really answered your question, but
yeah, I know one of the things that has always helped me, not necessarily like obviously because I've never really had long-term conversations with sports therapists and sports psychologists, is a quote somebody once told me, that bad things that happen to you aren't necessarily bad for you. And I've always sort of taken that as like some of the best things that happened to me in my life, and certainly in my football career, were off the back of massive negatives, were off the back of like arguably the worst things that have ever happened to me. So I've always sort of tried to take that mentality, and I must admit, mate, obviously the reason why I invited you on the podcast is because I appreciate your opinion, and I always have done since we've met one another. I'm well aware that other sports psychologists may think differently and may have other information, but the reason why obviously you're here is for me to get your insight for the benefit of other people. So I'm well aware that obviously it's not one size fits all, and there's no right or wrong answer, but you're giving us opinion, which I greatly appreciate.
Yeah, and I like that quote that you mentioned. It's something similar my dad mentioned to me, and I guess my time at Eastleigh, probably in my own reflections, probably didn't go as well as I wanted it to, as fresh-faced 22, 23-year-old straight out of my masters. So going into a professional football environment was a big step. But some of the best advice I received, and maybe in a similar vein to what you just said, was sometimes you have to go left to go up. My whole viewpoint was, right, I'm going to go from here straight out of my masters all the way up. I'm going to have a work in professional football. I'm going to have a full-time job, straight away. It just doesn't work like that. And again, the advice I was given, well, sometimes you might kind of dip and roller coaster ride, as everybody says, but sometimes you do have to go left to go up, as you say. Sometimes those bad things that do happen for you are actually not actually that bad for you.
Okay, mate. Let's the last thing, these pre-performance routines, and the reason, like, I think it might be a nice way to sort of segue into emulating what a conversation with you and a player might look like, by obviously using myself and my actual genuine sort of career and emotions as a case study. I know that sort of makes me a little bit more vulnerable, and my job most of the time is to interview guests and get all the information out of them as possible. But I think what might be a nice idea is that the information that possibly you can withdraw from me might be able to resonate with other people and help them. But performance anxiety, as a topic, as a starting topic, is that could sort of feed us into it. What is performance anxiety, and obviously, in your opinion, what can that do to somebody in their performance, specifically for football?
Yeah. So again, anxiety is something that's obviously thrown about quite a lot. So it's this idea of potentially an emotion that causes or is categorized by feelings of nervousness. So you might get butterflies in your stomach, worry, apprehension. You might become overstimulated, over-aroused, potentially. I know, I think it was Per Mertesacker, obviously he used to play for Arsenal, spoke a little bit around how he used to feel sick prior to a game and would go and throw up. And I know he's probably not the only one in that. And I know we've spoken a little bit before around Bojan, that used to play for Barcelona and Stoke. And I know it's something that we spoke about kind of prior to coming on to this. And he spoke around his anxiety prior to the 2008 Euros, I believe it was. But essentially, in terms of football, in terms of performance anxiety, it's caused by certain stressors. So it might be caused by the level of opposition you're playing. or by the team environment where you are in the league potentially. If you're fighting for promotion or fighting for titles, or likewise if you're fighting for relegation potentially. So that might cause extra anxiety, or through the added pressure and expectations that are put on you in terms of performance. So there's, I guess, from my perspective, there's two ways of looking at this. So it's whether you view this anxiety, and I know we've touched on it already, is whether you see that as positive, whether you use it as a way of facilitating positive performance, or whether it is that more negative effect of the anxiety. So again, in terms of how this could affect performance, so let's say we've got a central midfielder, hypothetically. A central midfielders, and again, excuse my naivety on the roles of football potentially, but in terms of a central midfielder, one of their roles is potentially to keep the ball moving. Okay, is to be almost that go-to, that middleman between defence and attack, depending on what type of football we're playing. Okay, so in terms of anxiety, their whole thing might be pre-game, I need to make 90% of my passes tonight. Okay, and if that negativity or if that anxiety is having a debilitative effect on him or her, they might doubt their ability to make those passes. So instead of being somebody that is maybe naturally quite creative and is always forward thinking, they might be somebody that suddenly, again, this is a loose example potentially, but they might be somebody that instead of playing those passes is always playing sideways, is always going backwards, because they lack almost that belief in themselves to play those passes that they would normally be associated with. So if we don't have, again, the demands or the resources to cope with these demands, we'd expect to see a negative impact on performance, whether that is passing accuracy or heavy legs is something that there's often spoke about. So you might see somebody almost feeling like they're running in cement or that type of thing. So there's different ways that it comes about. You might feel your heart beating through your chest, and you might not be able to cool down. So there's when you start, or when you play a game of football, you don't want to cool yourself down too much, because then your body's going to be working to heat yourself up. So again, if you can't bring your heart rate down and you feel really warm in yourself, or you feel like your body temperature is going through the roof, caused by this anxiety, then you might not be able to control your breathing when you're out on the football pitch potentially. So it takes different forms for different people. But if we don't have the resources to cope with it, we'd expect to see a negative performance or negative impact on their performance.
And some of those resources you're talking about are what we've spoken about already, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so let's move this on then, mate. As in, I've probably got about like 25-ish minutes left. Let's try and micro cram in what a conversation with you and a football player might look like. And hopefully people might be able to relate to this in some way, or at least get an insight into how a sports psychologist might be used.
Yeah, perfect. Okay.
How might a conversation like this end up starting? Yeah,
so again, for somebody like me, I'd like it to be on the football pitch. So it might be as we're walking between the changing room and being out on the pitch. So again, it might be a simple question. Start it off. How you feeling today, Joe? How you getting on? How's life at the minute? There's kind of open and loose questions that you maybe ask just to try and start a conversation.
I can give you an insight. At the moment, we're talking at on the 1st of March. So there is 11 games left of my season. Obviously at Aldershot, we are hovering above the relegation zone. We're in a comfortable, I would argue not comfortable, but we're doing okay. We're not in the relegation zone, but we're sort of above it. We have played more games than what other teams have. So if other teams win those games, they may catch us up or overtake us. So that is something at the moment, football specifically, that I'm anxious about. That we've sort of got a duty, or I certainly have as a captain in the next 11 games to get enough results that is going to see us safe. The last 4 games that we've played, we've picked up 1 point. So that's something that performances that we've just had aren't necessarily filling me with incredible amounts of confidence moving forward. We've got a huge game this weekend against Torquay, who sit below us in the table, which is arguably a must-win. So, yeah, you know, I've always sort of naturally been quite an anxious person. I've always been aware of, probably since school really, of what people think of me, and I know in the position I'm in at Aldershot, I need to perform. So that's sort of all accumulating into a certain level of I'd argue like nerves or anxiety that you've spoken about. So yes, sort of where I'm at sat here right now.
Yeah. And you mentioned your kind of duty as captain, obviously in your role at Aldershot. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and what you mean by that?
I mean, as captain at Aldershot, we've got a young team, right? And we've certainly got, you know, outstanding characters within the changing room. But my role as captain probably is as one of the older players. There's two of us that are sort of post 30. Everybody else is quite young, mid 20s and below. So me and a guy called Josh McCoy certainly take the responsibility of sort of being those experienced players that have been through maybe things before. My job at the moment is to speak, I guess, is to give my opinion, and the manager, you know, and I share quite a lot of conversations about how we think things look and how sort of match days were. And, you know, before the game, half time, after the game, I'm sort of leaned on to give my opinion on what I've seen and what I feel. However, I must admit that, you know, I love that role. You know, I'd do it anyway with the armband or not. But I've, you know, say for example, a couple of weeks ago, we played Wrexham on a Saturday, who were obviously doing very well in the National League. And I actually had this conversation with Tommy Elphick. You know, I'm probably sure that Tommy's conversation will be released before this, and people may, if they listen to this podcast, will hear it again. But we played Wrexham, it's 3-3. We scored sort of like in the 86th, 7th, 9th minute or whatever. And a draw at home to Wrexham was going to be an incredible result for us. And I sort of was even thinking at 90 minutes that, you know, we've got a draw out of this, and that's incredible. As Wrexham do, they sort of put us under pressure towards the end of the game with a long throw, and which was up to a corner. And that corner, you know, my responsibility as captain, I was sort of shouting about that this moment is big. Everybody needs to do their job. And the player that I was marking was on sort of like stood back post or sort of stood on the far corner of the 6-yard box. And as he started running, you know, I obviously started to chase him, but he sort of got a yard on me in front of me. The corner landed, you know, perfectly on his head in the front post. And he scored. They won 4-3. And, you know, the man who scored, I was marking. And as, you know, as a captain, I felt completely responsible, really for that. And that's something that even probably 2 weeks ago I'm still carrying a little bit. I'm now questioning how am I able to give my opinion and tell other guys to do this or that if, you know, I can't do my job myself. And I'm sort of aware of that, and that's something that's been difficult for me the last couple of weeks to sort of overcome.
Yeah, and you know, there's obviously some stuff there that, you know, we could talk about for a wee bit, but in terms of obviously that specifically, and you spoke a little bit around responsibility and completely almost being completely your fault, but completely or your sole responsibility in that game, in that moment. I just wondered, has anybody kind of backed those feelings up or spoken to you about that from the coaching team?
Yeah, I had a conversation with the manager. Well, immediately after the game, really. Obviously, he saw that I was gutted, and I told him like that was my man. I was like, I've let everybody down. I sort of walked in the change room and told the guys, look, like if we need somebody to blame, like blame me. Like that's in that last moment of the game. I shouldn't have let that guy get in front of me and score. Certainly wasn't for a lack of effort, so I've never questioned my effort. It was sort of just like in literally that split second moment, he made a run, and although I followed him, I was following him from behind, and the ball landed on his head. I sort of, so I mean, the manager told me not to. Of course, the manager's a great person, and he told me not to worry, and that I had done more in that game that warranted a positive performance than a negative. However, you know, a long-lasting memory of that moment will always be that I was at fault and that I was solely responsible. You know, we conceded 3 other goals, right? But I was solely responsible for the reason why we didn't get a point in that game.
Yeah, and again, in terms of for the podcast, I guess from my perspective now, be almost around trying to rationalize those thoughts. And I know we've only got a short amount of time, so I won't go too much into that, but be asking questions around, well, is this, or was the loss, again, as you say, solely your responsibility? As you've said, you've let the team's let in 3 other goals. So again, it's trying to potentially unpack that a little bit further and rationalise kind of those feelings. And that would be, again, the type of conversation that I'd like to go into a little bit further with you about, and just kind of say, well, in terms of the manager's thoughts and what the players have said, how have you felt that your responsibility as captain has changed, particularly over the course of the season and into now?
From the start of the season till now, not a great amount, because we've not really necessarily had older players, and we've certainly got young players who give their opinion, and very well, I must add. Can't imagine many of them listen to this podcast, but if they do, I must admit that we've got intelligent people in our changing room. So my job as captain isn't maybe to represent everyone, because opinions are different. We actually had a conversation sort of last week off the back of a defeat where a lot of us gave different opinions. It didn't matter if it was me or a young player, and they weren't all the same. And I actually ended up saying that us having these conversations is fantastic. I think we need to have them to gain, obviously, a relationship with one another that's going to hopefully mean positive results on Saturday. We ended up getting beat by Barnet 4-1, so it didn't necessarily have a great effect. But no, my responsibility as a captain, I'm still unsure about what it is really. And I would argue that most captains sort of would probably say the same thing. There's no sort of like, this is what you must do. I suppose I've always tried to be completely myself and not bend or do anything because I think it's what I should do. I've always tried to just do what I feel and sort of the instincts that I have really in any moment that comes. I'm quite conscious maybe that because I am the captain and that comes with a certain stigma, that I don't want it to seem as if that puts me in any position above or below anybody else, right? That I ultimately am just another player.
Yeah.
Who does obviously get the opportunity to give their opinion, maybe more than others. I'm well aware of that, but no, I wouldn't say that. Obviously, answering your question on has it changed my role from start to the season till now? Not really too much, to be honest. No.
Yeah. And again, just get your thoughts on this and just breaking it down a little bit. You've mentioned that you're unsure specifically what your role is as a captain entails, and again, then you're taking, I guess, suggesting that you should be taking maybe more responsibility than others. And it's, from my perspective, and I would like to get your opinion on this. It's if you don't know what the role is, and in terms of, then you're taking more responsibility. If you're unsure of what that is or what that role entails, how do you feel about taking more responsibility for that, even though you don't understand, but don't fully know what it is that is being asked of you, so to speak?
I mean, we've had 2 managers this season. The first manager told me when I signed that I was going to sort of take this role up. I wasn't then given, obviously, a script as to this is what it looks like and this is what I want you to do. Yeah. Maybe, that when we break it down, it's just, I guess, an extension of who I am as a person already. And then obviously the manager coming in trusted me to continue doing that job. And I'm sort of still unsure. There's not sort of like, nobody gave me like a list of rules as to what you're supposed to do. And I would argue that any other captain at any other club may possibly feel the same. I suppose I do what I feel is right in the moment, and just continue to try and make better decisions than I make bad.
Yeah, no, I agree. And again, it's probably not something for now, but coming into that position potentially, next season, let's say it's sitting down and going through with the team and with the coaching staff, almost trying to break down what that role is and what is expected of you. And I think, in terms of for this conversation, it's probably in terms of detail, we can't go into too much about that. But in terms of for understanding roles, understanding almost what's required of you, I think that would be really powerful. You know, understanding what's expected from the coach staff, expected from the captain, expected from the players, almost those values, those attitudes, those beliefs that are put in place, and that becomes a really powerful system to then almost self-police things over the year. But in terms of a conversation that we would have maybe more around the kind of football side of things and what we mentioned recently, in terms of obviously the Wrexham game, in terms of that, what my overarching theme or overarching questions would be, you know, who tells you or who told you that's your responsibility? You know, what would have happened if it was somebody else? You know, again, there's from an analysis point of view, I'd want to break that down a little bit further and say, well, that's just one point in the rest of the game. We try and break that down in terms of trying to rationalise things and how we can. Again, you said the manager said it was your performance was positive for the whole game. So again, we try and again, I've used this word quite a lot, reframe things around that performance. Yes, it is one moment, and it is obviously a significant moment as you've alluded to. But again, we're trying to break down the rest of the performance. So that's something we do together potentially as a part of this. And I know some of the questions that we speak about would be around how long would this kind of continue for, you know, and a session normally would you'd argue maybe half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, really. But you know, sometimes the best conversations that I would maybe have, or you would maybe have with coaches, staff, sports psychologists, physios, whoever it may be, would be on the training pitch whilst simple things, collecting footballs, collecting cones. So that's where the most powerful conversations are had. And that's where, again, I think a lot of sports psychologists want to work. So in terms of what a session would look like, which I know is a little bit around this and what we wanted to achieve. This is a very, I guess, forced is the wrong word, but it's almost a set-up conversation, right? So in terms of how many sports psychologists would want to work, it wouldn't look like this. More often than not, it wouldn't necessarily be in an office, which I think is, again, some of the concerns and issues around using a sports psychologist, right? They're going to get me laying down on a chair and speaking to me while my eyes are shut and things like that, and that just doesn't happen. So in terms of what something like this would look like on the training pitch, involved in a small-sided game. So, you know, when we were at Eastleigh, we used to have small-sided rondos at the start of a session. So when that happens, you know, sports psychologist gets involved, and I got involved in a couple of things at Eastleigh. Nothing major. I think my skill set was too great for you guys. I wasn't quite competent enough, but that's the type of place where those conversations happen, you know. And then there would maybe be a follow-up session potentially. You know, you walk around the football pitch, you go for a coffee, you go and sit in a coffee shop, and I think for me, and I hope for yourself as well, it's almost around getting rid of that stigma of sports psychologist is going to get me sat down in a classroom in an office and just going to tell me what's going wrong. That's not the case. It's a really relaxed environment where you feel most comfortable, whether that is in a coffee shop or whether that is at the training pitch. You know, it might just be sat down on a football pitch having a conversation. So so for me, sports psychology is not sat in an office, is not sat speaking to somebody like a patient, so to speak. It's being out on the football pitch, being involved in sessions, you know, and using that as a tool to generate those conversations as we kind of already had in terms of, you know, around anxiety and around you know, it doesn't have to be anxiety. You know, we've spoken about it a lot, but it could be around what's going really well, you know, and maintaining that. It doesn't have to be, as I say, when things are going wrong. That's, I guess, my two pennies worth for what sports psychology is.
See, let's before we finish, mate, wonder, it might be nice for people to get a perception, because you've spoken about Per Mertesacker and Bojan there, who most people listening to this podcast would recognise their names. Obviously, Mertesacker was an incredibly successful centre back. I'm pretty sure he won the World Cup with Germany. And Bojan was part of Barcelona's arguably best ever team, right?
Yeah.
Surrounded by some of the best players that have ever lived, and they both suffered with anxiety, and that obviously affecting their performance. When you spoke about Per Mertesacker being sick before games, I have done that myself. Like I've been physically sick, and I always strangely felt more comfortable after I'd thrown up than what I did before. It's really, really super strange. And it's sort of probably most happened whilst I was a player at Bristol Rovers, because I was just so desperate to do well, so desperate probably for people to like me, for my teammates to think I was good, to be involved and perform positively in good results for the club. Just because it was so well supported, I was so desperate to be liked, right? To have that positive impact on a football club. And I always sort of thought like I was battling against that. Like I was never really too sure if I was doing a good job or not. Like I'd never read anything online, because I knew if I read anything badly, then it would really affect me, right? It would affect me negatively. So what would you suggest? Say, like, obviously I don't go through those sort of feelings now. I've sort of, and I would argue that I've not done anything to do that. Like I still feel nerves. I just don't throw up before games. It's not as bad. It's probably not as intense as it was then. But going back to that time, what would you suggest some of the things that I would have been able to do to sort of ease those feelings of sort of seriousness and anxiety before match days?
Yeah, and it's probably difficult in some ways, because you've kind of alluded to, you've associated that action of maybe being sick before a game, and I don't know whether it was kind of match day or the night before, but you've associated that action with being potentially quite positive. As you said, it made you feel better afterwards.
Yeah, I used to struggle to eat, mate. Yeah. Probably if I knew that I was playing in the game on the Saturday, which was honestly like hit and miss sometimes at Rovers, because the manager would always change the team. So there was a lot of anxiety about being in the team or not, for a start. Yeah. And then when I knew that I was, even on like Thursday night, all day Friday, I found it difficult to eat. Like I found it really difficult to like keep a big amount of food down, if that makes sense. That was, really struggled.
Yeah, and again, it's, you've associated that feeling with being quite positive afterwards. So again, it's about trying to disassociate that with, or that action of being positive for you, because you need food for fuel, essentially, for the food is positive. So again, it's trying to reframe those feelings and those actions with, actually, well, that can be quite negative for me. It's I'm getting rid of all of the food and all of the fuel that I've put into my body potentially on the Friday before a Saturday game. Let's say, so we trying to associate that with maybe being negative is again a strong phrase, but you want to associate food with being good for you, being healthy. I'm putting it in my body for fuel. I know by doing this, by eating, pasta is the common one, right? Stereotyping here, but I'm eating a large portion of pasta, carb loading before the Saturday match, right? And it's associating that now with, well, that is a helpful behaviour, that is a helpful thing to do in terms of how I'm going to perform on a Saturday. So we had a player that I used to work with that was similar. Wouldn't eat, would feel sick prior to a game. And it was trying to put things in place to help her at the time almost not have those feelings, or have them less than what she was having before. So again, we touched on it briefly, but putting in a routine that she knew was helpful for her performance, and that routine would involve, well, at this time of day, I'm going to eat a certain amount of food. I'm going to have porridge and a banana for breakfast, let's say. Okay, or the night before, I'm going to have a big pasta meal to carb load before the game. I know that is helpful for my performance. So again, pre-performance routine doesn't have to be a couple of hours before the game. It can be the week before a game, or a couple of days before the game. So if we can start to put into that routine things such as food and eating, it might be having a gel, 2-hour SIS gel before a game, and might be having a banana or a coffee, or whatever it is to kind of fuel you up before this game, as that's a helpful behaviour. So for me, again, it's it's around reframing those beliefs and attitudes around that thing. So again, if that is thrown up before a game, well, we know that we need the food, so we know that is potentially going to have a negative impact long term on me in terms of performance. So it's now trying to reframe that and make that, well, actually, I know the food is positive for me. So if I eat well, my belief is that I'm going to have a good performance, and then the consequence of those beliefs are, or the consequence of that action is, I feel good about myself. I feel good going into this game. I have a good performance. So you want to try and change those beliefs that you have about that action, so to speak, into a more positive.
And how have you found, in your experience, how difficult of a process that is? Because it's obviously easy, right, for us to talk about. Just tell yourself that eating food on a Friday is good for you, and then suddenly all my anxiety and all my and people's stress, and whoever's listening to this that gets nervous, I would argue that most people get nervous, but super nervous before games, just disappears. It's sort of obviously not that easy, right? No. How long, or I would argue how long, because it's probably not one size fits all, but what's the process of trying to change behaviour? Do you know what I mean? Is it really difficult?
Yeah. So again, not no one size fits all, as you've said, and psychology is a skill. This is similar to a physical skill. You need to practice it to get better, and we could put in a routine for you, let's say, and you could put it into practice, but it's not going to work straight away. It's something that you're going to have to practice and master and tweak over time to essentially find the best fit for you, and that's kind of what it is in terms of trying to find the best fit, the best size, so to speak, for you that works the best. So again, it's a process. It's like learning a physical performance skill. It's going to take time to master, but it's that labor of love. It's that persistence. You've got to keep trying with it. And if something doesn't work, if you don't feel it's working, let's say you listen to, as part of this pre-match thing, you listen to certain music, what's the word? Music playlist, or you eat a certain thing, or you do a certain thing at a certain time. If that doesn't work, well, maybe take that out and try something else. So again, it's a labor of love. You've got to tweak it. You've got to practice it over time to then try and find the best fit for you. And as I say, it is difficult. It is going to take time, but hopefully over a pre-season schedule, if you've given yourself and almost that ability to try and change things over that period prior to the season starting, and by that time, hopefully you'll found your best fit, so to speak. That would be feasible, and as I say, it's not going to happen overnight.
I know it's a tough conversation for us to have, mate, really, isn't it? Because I'm well aware that obviously I am much different to other people. Mm-hmm. So, and the reason why I've decided obviously to try and have a conversation with you and give people sort of probably more of an insight into how I feel in my career than I ever have done is to show that these conversations, what they look like, and two, that they can be beneficial and hopefully sort of stop the stigma around sports therapy and sports psychology being such an intense thing, right? Mm-hmm. Listen, mate, you know, I think that was really insightful. I hope that people obviously enjoy listening to this and have been able to get anything from it. I'll include obviously all your social media handles and stuff like that. So if anybody ever wants to reach out to James Maiden, then I'm sure obviously I'll love to hear from you. And from my perspective, mate, just want to say thank you for one, allowing us obviously into the university, and two, speaking with me and being able to sort of help and guide me on the things that we've spoken about. All the things that we have discussed in terms of and just to recap for people obviously who are listening and want to take things away, the things that we discussed were building a mindset and what mindset looks like, developing mental skills, and the things that we spoke about were using imagery, pre-performance routines, relaxation and breathing techniques. We didn't really talk about that too much, did we, mate? But self-talk, imagery, and the pre-performance routines as probably being the main three things that people can easily do at home, right? Also, one of the things that you spoke about at the very start of this conversation, for anybody who has forgotten, is writing down how you feel to understand your emotions better. Is there anything I've left out, mate, that you think you might want to add?
No, I think one of the things that I guess just kind of encompasses all of that, and maybe one of the reasons why we undertake those things and why we do those mental skills, so to speak, is around controlling the controllable, right? And that's probably a phrase that you've probably heard, and probably some of the listeners have heard as well. But football's chaotic. It's an environment that has so many moving parts, loads of plates spinning, and you as a footballer are just one of those plates, and you have your own plates that are spinning. So again, if we can control those small things that you have control over, so again, whether it is your daily life, how you train, how you eat, those types of things, it's around trying to put yourself in the best frame of mind going into that. So this idea of preparing well, this idea of, well, I've done everything I can, everything that's in my control, and everything else will go essentially how it will. There's things, a lot of the stresses that we've spoken about are out of a footballer's control. That's what causes the stress. But if you can control those things within your remit, again, it's all around trying to build those resources up. So control those resources, control what you have, and hopefully the demands will be outweighed.
Is that your overriding sort of generic piece of advice that you would give to, obviously, because we're not talking to individuals here, we're talking to the sort of the masses, but that what is in your mind as your overriding piece of advice, obviously off the back of your experiences and opinions on football and psychology, what would your advice be for, if you had to give us your best piece of advice, what would it be?
Put me on the spot, but yeah, I think control the controllable. It's an easy statement to remember, right? And that for me is one of the biggest things that you can do if you're trying to control what's those things that may be outside of your control. You're always going to be fighting a losing battle. The fire's never going to be put out, so to speak. So again, if you can control what you're doing and keep moving forward with what you're doing that's within your own remit, then that would be my biggest piece of advice. Do the things that you can influence, focus on those. Again, whether that's nutrition, whether that's psychology, whether that's physical performance, those are some of the things that you can control. We've spoken around social media and negative comments. Can't control those. You can't control what people put on social media and Twitter and those type of things about us. So if you're trying to control those, that's a losing battle that you'll never win, unless you obviously delete the social media apps and things like that. But biggest piece of advice: control the controllables. Control what you can control. That's it.
Nice, James. I appreciate it, mate. We could have spoken for much longer, but I'm conscious that people might get bored of hearing my voice. Certainly not yours. But thank you very much, mate. Hopefully this has given a lot of people loads of benefit and they at least enjoyed it. Obviously, please, people, when you listen to this, I don't ask you that much, but please obviously share this as much as possible. It means a lot to us, obviously, that a lot of you listen to it. Please do all the like, rate, subscribes, and reach out to us if there's anything that you want to hear about, or if there's any questions that you want to ask. So appreciate everybody's time, James, especially yours. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.